Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to take a break from our Central Florida very hot summer that we're having to talk about sourdough. Sourdough is one of my passions alongside gardening. I really love sourdough. I make tons of stuff with sourdough. I make sourdough artisan loaves, English muffins, waffles. I even make pasta with my sourdough. Pretty much anything that contains flour or is a bread product we no longer buy. That's because I start all of our bread products with Elizabeth here. So you might be wondering, what exactly is sourdough? So sourdough, and in particular Elizabeth here, is a sourdough starter. Sourdough starter is the leavening agent to make a bread rise. You might be more familiar with active dry yeast, which is something that you can buy in the grocery store that will help rise your bread. But for thousands and thousands of years, people used sourdough starter instead of the more commercially produced products like active dry yeast. In fact, they're not even sure exactly when sourdough starter was created or how it was created even. It dates all the way back to ancient Egypt, and this is actually how they leavened their bread or made it rise. Prior to leavening, you would only have unleavened bread, things like flatbreads or pita or crackers. But once sourdough starter was created, that's when they were able to make those beautiful rise in the bread and give that soft texture that comes in the center of the bread. There's even stories of people who were exploring the United States and going out west, carrying with them their own sourdough starter so that they could make bread wherever they were. There's even a story about people, early explorers or earlier inhabitants of the Alaskan wilderness, that would carry and sleep with their sourdough starter to ensure that it didn't get too cold. Now, sourdough starter is actually a fermented product, which is very interesting. It's a fermented flour. It's simply flour and water that has been allowed to mix up and set at room temperature until it does ferment. When you first start a sourdough starter, what you are doing is you're combining the flour and the water together to ferment on your countertop or at room temperature. And what this does is it creates a place where good and bad bacteria are living inside of the container with a breathable cover. I have a paper towel here. And what ends up happening is the good bacteria that's in the air and actually on the flour or the wheat germ that the flour was ground from eventually wins out against the bad bacteria. And it also produces a lactic acid. The lactic acid, through that fermentation process, actually keeps the fermented flour or the sourdough starter from going bad out on the counter because it kills off all the bad bacteria. So it basically preserves itself. So why would you use a sourdough starter rather than active dry yeast? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the health benefits. So when you use a fermented product, whether that's vinegar or yogurt or sauerkraut or a sourdough starter, you are getting really good probiotics and it helps with digestion. Because the sourdough starter is a fermented product and it kills that bad bacteria, grows the good bacteria, and puts off a lactic acid, it allows for the nutrition in the bread, the nutrients and the antioxidants to be more readily available when it's being digested. So sourdough bread and sourdough products tend to be more nutritious. Because you're using flour, there is gluten in the product that you're making, whether it be sourdough bread or sourdough waffles. And for many people, gluten can be difficult to digest. The cool thing about a sourdough starter is that it is fermenting all of that gluten, and it doesn't go away. The gluten is still there, but it does break it down to where it becomes much more easily digestible. That's not to say that somebody with celiac disease could eat sourdough bread. It does still have gluten in it. But those with slight intolerances or people that just feel icky after eating bread, you might want to try sourdough bread because it does break down that gluten and makes it much more easier to digest. Another reason I like to eat sourdough bread for the health benefits is there are 0 preservatives in my bread. There is flour, water, sometimes salt, sometimes milk, sometimes oil. Depends on what I'm making. And I make a ton of stuff with sourdough. I have a passion for sourdough, and for all those reasons that I mentioned, but also because I like the idea that this is a cleaner product. I've created it myself. I've cooked and baked everything myself with the most limited ingredients, and it still tastes amazing. It's just cleaner for your body and also for our environment, which I am very passionate about as well. We were given this planet and these bodies as gifts, and so I want to make sure that I am always treating those both with respect in what I put in my body and what my participation is in using the resources of our planet. But now let's get into the fun part. Let's talk about how you can make your own sourdough starter and the steps that are involved. None of the steps are hard, but it will take some time. So here we are on day 1, and we are going to talk about measuring. So what you want to use is either a scale or you can use cups, although a scale does tend to be more accurate. And you're going to measure out about 20 to 30 grams of water and then 20 to 30 grams or an equal amount of whole wheat flour. Whole wheat flour has more bacteria on it because it is a whole product rather than the unbleached white flour. If you wanted to use cups, you could do this, but you want to make sure that you are aware that water is heavier than flour. So if you're going to use cups, think about using 1/8 of a cup of water to 1/4 of a cup of flour. So double the amount of flour than water if you are not going to use a scale. Then you'll just want to cover it with something that is breathable. I'm using a paper towel. You can use cheesecloth. And then I'm also marking it at this point just so I can monitor if it is rising, and you'll want to do that for every day. So now we're on day 2, and the only thing that you have to do on day 2 is just stir it around a little bit. I actually don't add or discard at this point. Just cover it up and place it on your counter at room temperature. Now we're on day 3. Day 3 is a day that you're actually going to start discarding. And discarding basically means that anything that is above the measurement that you need, that you still have in the jar, gets thrown away or put in your compost pile. So what you see me doing here is I'm taking some of my starter, enough so that I measure out my 20 or 30 grams into a separate cup just because it's easier to do the mixing and measuring. I'm going to add the same amount or equal parts of water in grams and flour. This time I am going to use an unbleached white flour rather than the wheat flour. You can't really use the discard at this point, the stuff that's left in the jar after you've done your measurements, just because the amount of bad bacteria has not reached a point where the good bacteria has overwhelmed it. So at this point, you really don't want to be using that for any of those really cool discard recipes that you see online. You'll also want to make sure that you mark the jar. Again, you saw that I had some rise on the first one, but you're going to see a significant amount of rise happening here shortly. Don't get excited. This rise is going to go away pretty quickly. So we're just going to cover that, and we're going to mark it just so we can continue to monitor its progress. So here we are about 12 hours after day 3, and you can see lots and lots of bubbles all the way around the jar, as well as you can see from the mark that we have at least doubled. Don't get excited about this. Your starter is going to go through a lot of changes over the next 7 to 30 days. On day 4 here, you can see we still have that rise. It's still there. It hasn't even peaked. It got even higher than it was before, but I'm going to do the same thing I did on day 3. I'm going to discard. I'm going to add equal amounts of water and flour and mix it together really good, and then you'll see that I'm actually adding it right back into the same jar. Some people like to change out their jars every time. I don't. I like to maybe change it out once a week, and it will get a little bit gross looking, but it does keep all of that bacteria in the same jar, which is good. So we're going to cover it up, and here we are on day 5, and this is actually the day where I do go ahead and start with a clean jar. This jar has gotten pretty funky, pretty sticky, really stiff. But you can see from the starter there that it is starting to get kind of more of a runnier consistency rather than that thick, pasty consistency that we had seen before. So you'll discard, you'll add your equal amounts of water and flour to that equal amount of discard, mix well, and here I'll be adding it to a new, clean, fresh jar. Be careful when you are cleaning off your instruments or your tools or your cups with that sourdough starter, because it does turn into something similar to like a cement. It is crazy. Here we are on day 6, doing the same exact steps. But don't, like I was saying, don't put your starter or your discard out into your sink. It does become very, very thick. It creates almost like a cement-like property, and it can clog up your plumbing. So really wipe it off with a paper towel. Rinse your jar out and let it soak until it softens, and then dump that, outside or in your compost bin or in the trash. Here we are, like I said, on day 6. A lot of recipes for sourdough starters do talk about, being able to get a starter up and running in 7 days. I'm going to be the bearer of bad news here and tell you that it does not usually take 7 days. It usually takes much longer. Some people are able to speed up this time by, doing twice-a-day feeds rather than once a day. There's some other things that you can do around the water, making sure that you leave your water out on the counter if you're using tap water, because it does have chlorine in it. Using bottled water if you have a water softener like I do, which can impact the bacteria. Other people also go to great lengths to keep their starter warm, because it does seem to grow faster when it's warmer, and that would be anything over 75 degrees. You can keep it in a warm spot like above your fridge or on your oven, as long as there's an oven light on. At the end of the day, the best way to handle this is to just discard and feed once a day, and you will eventually get an active starter. That's how you make your sourdough starter. And once you have a super active starter, you can make a ton of things. I use this in everything. But there are some things to look out for with your starter. You want to make sure that it hasn't gone bad. And the biggest indication that something has gone wrong with your starter is mold. So if you look in here and you see fuzzy, white, or black mold, this needs to be thrown away and you need to start a new starter. Other indications that things might be going wrong is a smell that is very off-putting or rotten. Now, mind you, sourdough does have a smell. It has a yeasty, kind of that fermented type product smell, tangy. Sometimes it can even smell like nail polish remover, especially if it's hungry. So it does come with a lot of weird smells. None of them I find are bad. Although it can be a little bit of a surprise to smell your starter and smell nail polish remover. But really what you're looking for is a smell that is smelling rotten or musky or something like that. Usually means that the bad bacteria has won out over the good bacteria and you will start to see mold. Another thing that will happen is you will not be getting the bubbles or the rise that the sourdough starter is supposed to have. And that is another clear indication that your sourdough starter has gone bad. Now, it should take a very, very long time before your sourdough starter goes bad. If you treat it correctly, feed it properly, I've known people that have sourdough starters live for 30 to 50 years. But all good things will end eventually. And you may, in the course of your lifetime, have to start a second starter. Or an even better idea is once your starter is up and active and really doing good, dehydrate your starter. And that way you can keep it on hand so that if you ever do have a problem with your current starter, you can always rehydrate that dehydrated starter and you're back up and running in no time. Keep a lookout for a future video where I am going to actually make a very beautiful artisan sourdough loaf. If you can think of any other recipes that you would like to try out, leave me a comment and I'll do some videos on those as well. Also, if you have any questions about your specific sourdough starter that you are growing, leave them in the comments and I will be sure to answer them all.